It is with great pleasure that I introduce our two speakers for today. We have Kelsey Campbell, who is a second-year MA student in English studying sociolinguistics, and we have Dr. Walt Wolfram, who is the William C. Friday Distinguished University Professor in English and specializing in sociolinguistics. So, we're very excited to learn a little bit more about the political life of language, so I will let them take it away.
Let me first of all say that I don't do my primary research in the area of political language that other people do, but I do feel that linguists have an obligation when linguistic variation that is commented on in the public is taking place. We then have an obligation to address it, because as linguists, we think that social linguistics is everywhere and it's in common practices. And this political campaign has probably brought language to the fore more than I can remember in my lifetime, which means that it's more than your lifetime as well. So, so welcome to it. And just sort of contextualizing it, let me give a couple of points. As we thought about it, there are actually four areas in which language might impact. One is speaker identity and political life. So, how do politicians from different areas, regions, ethnicities, social background, how do they sound? How does that situate them as people, as leaders, as politicians, and what do people think about them? Then another question that's received a lot of comment is, how do politicians differ in their language use? So we have different politicians, they use language, they don't all use it the same, so how do they differ? And then what does it mean? And how is language sometimes used strategically for political advantage? So what strategies do people use, to persuade, convince, deny, oppose, and all those good things? And then the final dimension is, what effect does political language have on the public, and how are voters' ideologies connected to language? So in this sense, there are a number of different areas, and I gave a talk similar to this yesterday, and it ran over 75 minutes, which actually speaks to how long-winded I am, and to the fact there's so much stuff that I've had to cut some of it out. So we'll see what we can do. In terms of the people that come up in this conversation, we have George W. Bush, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump are our main principles in terms of illustration, okay? So let's just sort of start with speaker identity and what we'll refer to as the New York City effect, because as it turns out, two of our candidates for office were from New York City originally, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And Vox has a nice little video, I'll only play part of you, that highlights this. The phonetics is a little off, but don't worry about it.
In the U.S. Senate, but you've likely noticed
billionaires and billionaires
that his voice represents another place entirely, and another time.
Is that loud enough?
New York City, where the world's nations sit side by side.
Sanders grew up in Brooklyn in the 1940s and 50s. The city had long ago developed a distinctive accent. Surprisingly, its features can be traced back to the early English settlers, rather than the big waves of immigration that came later.
The most famous feature of the New York City accent is probably what linguists call the thought vowel, and I just said it in a very New York way.
Talk the issues with people.
and second of all,
There is a broad consensus.
When Bernie Sanders says these words, the position of the vowel is raised. So what does that mean? For me, it was helpful to look at this chart of vowel sounds. It's shaped like this because it's essentially a diagram of your mouth, with the vowels mapped according to the position of your tongue when you say them. Try saying E and oo and pay attention to your tongue. E,
You don't have to do that here.
E. No, really, try it. E, oo, e, oo, e, oo. forward and back, but it can also move up and down. Without moving your jaw too much, try A and E. A, E, A, E, A, E. Researchers can measure the position of these vowels by analyzing their frequencies. So what's happening with the New York City thought vowel is that it stays back, but it moves up. Instead of thought, you get thought. This feature is becoming less distinct with each generation, according to a recent survey of native New Yorkers, particularly among white people. The more recent the birth year, the lower the thought vowel. It goes from coffee to coffee.
The cough, right? None of my nephews or nieces will say it that way.
You can also hear Bernie Sanders' New York roots in his R's, or actually in his lack of R's.
Within the Democratic Party,
Our computers.
Denmark.
In November.
Like the dialects from Boston,
You're not. Sorry?
and Savannah,
I like to go under the speed limit.
the New York City accent is historically non-rhotic, meaning R's often get dropped except before vowels. So newscasters call him
Bernie Sanders.
but he calls himself.
Bernie Sanders.
R dropping is something that became fashionable in London in the late 1700s, before spreading to the east coast of the US.
there must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
But now it too is fading.
After the Second World War, it lost its prestige.
Americans were focused on their own identity rather than maintaining ties to England. And as pop culture increasingly portrayed New Yorkers as criminals, the stigma led some to intentionally lose their accent.
Okay, we'll stop at that point because it gets a little speculative as to why the prestige changed. But there are a couple of lessons. In terms of the phonetics, I just sort of have to make one correction. While it's true about the raising of the all vowel, a significant part of the New York City vowel is not simply the raising or the lowering of the all vowel, but the fact that it glides inward too. So it's not simply thought, all right, or thought, it's thought. So in that sense, sort of, they didn't quite get it right, but it's not a bad attempt at science accommodation for linguists, that is trying to make linguistics manageable. And the fact of the matter is that all of the politicians have to make choices in their R's, okay? So since there is no such thing as a dialect-less R, we'll just sort of see among some of the choices that they have here as recorded by
the pronunciation of the vowel in bought. Speaker 1, Outer Banks.
That's
Speaker 2, Boston.
Bought.
Speaker 3, Rural North Carolina.
Bought.
Speaker 4, Philadelphia.
Bought.
Okay, so that's made, and the significance of it is Bernie Sanders had a really good older New York City vowel, bought, and Donald Trump, all right, went down a little, but he was also in a different social class and of a different region. So they participate in this vowel, while the others, for example, Bush is from Southern. Some parts is from Texas. Some parts of Texas may actually say bow, but that wouldn't work because people tend to giggle and think of you as country, so that wouldn't work. So he changes it more to bot. And Hillary Clinton, does anybody know what aw she uses? Okay, she tends to merge it, which tends to be sort of the least salient. All right. So most of the the two candidates really identify themselves. So the first person we want to look at, because all of these dimensions sort of intersect with how the speakers identify themselves, where they come from, and how that affects who they are. All right. So there's a recent book which is written Articulate While Black, and in this book, this is what they say about Barack Obama, that he really has the capability to shift into more relaxed or informal, sort of registering his African-Americanness. And whether or not that's true, we're going to look at his speech just a minute here, and I'll give you a sample. If you look at this, what you're going to hear him say, since it's spontaneous, you'll have to listen fairly closely, but we'll try to get to the spot here. Okay, and about here. Okay. Obama that most people don't hear in terms of the yearly speeches or interacting, because there are a couple features. He says, nah, we straight, all right? That nah is not something, well, other than George Bush, actually presidents tend to use, all right? It tends to have a slightly different phonetic rendering and significance in the African American. Then he has the absence of B or the copula where he says, nah, we straight, all right? And then he uses y'all, despite the fact that, of course, he's from Hawaii and Kansas, where it wouldn't be used. Danica, who filmed the church where he spent his time in Chicago, can certainly reassure us that that church exposed him to lots of African American English. So whether or not he spoke it coming up, he certainly has connected and utilized enough of it to sort of render himself as African American. But that's not the Barack Obama that most people hear. And his language itself has become an object of scrutiny by the public. So we have some wonderful comments. Here's a comment that took place before his first period of his first year, whatever it is, term in office was from Joe Biden.
Like everybody these days, Biden declared online, but it was old media that got him in trouble. Personal comments he made about another White House hopeful, Senator Barack Obama, recorded by a reporter for the New York Observer.
I mean, you got the first sort of mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean, and nice looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man.
Biden.
Okay, so that gives you an idea, and it came up more recently, all right, in this one where George Bush talks about Obama when he was running for office.
And Bush, this.
How do you think the troops would feel about President Obama?
Oh, I don't know. He hadn't gotten elected yet. He ain't even got the party's nomination. He's an attractive guy. He's articulate. I've been impressed with him when I've seen him in person. But he's got a long way to go to be president.
I thought the president gave the senator a compliment. Boy, was I wrong. Writing in the Chicago Trib, Dawn Turner Trice put forth, quote, articulate is a code word, and the inference often is this: wow, you're black and can speak standard English and skillfully? Oh my gosh. Articulate is our generation's euphemistic equivalent to aren't you the little credit to your race, unquote. Wow, who knew? I didn't know. Joining us now from Philadelphia, Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, teaches urban education and American studies at Temple University. Now you gotta feel sorry for us white folks here, because I'm telling you now, I'm afraid to say anything. You know, you're an articulate guy, doctor, but I'm never gonna say that. You're a smart guy. Is that bad if I say you're a smart guy?
Smart's okay, and see, Bill, coming from you, I know your intention, so I would never doubt what you mean by it. But unfortunately, when articulate is used by white people toward black people, it's often accompanied by a sense of bewilderment and surprise, i.e., I'm surprised that you're able to speak that well. Coming from somebody like President Bush in particular, it's a bit curious. He's the same person who said that he rails against the soft bigotry of low expectations, and then he hurls such a lowball compliment at Barack Obama. To me, if Barack Obama could not speak articulately, if he could not clearly express his ideas, that would be noteworthy, not him having 2 Ivy League degrees and not being able to express his ideas.
I gotta tell you, President Bush is as surprised as I am that when
you see how this descriptor of articulate comes into play, and as interpreted by some, you know, turns into a kind of sort of enlightened exceptionalism, where sort of people, individuals are actually embraced and separated from others, you know, in a sense in which you're exceptionalized. And so this whole exceptionalization of Barack Obama's speech becomes an indication or an association with his African American status. So it's interesting because Sami Alim, who was one of the co-authors of this book, gave a survey to some of his students at Stanford, and some were African American, some were white and Asian, and he asked them how they would feel if their speech was described as articulate, and African Americans found it to be an insult. They were especially offended by it. Whites were uplifted and proud of being described that way. Asians were slightly offended, but would accept the phrase as a kind of compliment. So we see sort of a differentiation and how a more subtle form of racism, point two, comes into play in terms of his speech. So there are a couple of things that we can summarize in terms of talking about personal identity. One is there is a sense of authenticity, and I would say that Bernie Sanders' authenticity was actually contextualized and encouraged and inspired by the way he spoke. So here's an authentic guy who talks like he's from New York, all right, who is just sort of giving it to us as I am, as it is. On the other hand, for example, Hillary Clinton, who appears to most people to be accentless, you know, oh, she may be hiding behind that. Where is her authenticity, all right? So there's this identity, and along the way, it indexes the social attributes and stereotypes of personal or regional ethnic groups. So for example, if Bush, as some Texans do, would have said cult, all right, it would have been associated with the sort of rural country style of speaking, which is not befitting of a presidential candidate. Well, we'll leave it there. And furthermore, it can become a site of inequality. Inequality in terms of race, ethnicity, class, gender, and so forth. So Kelsey will speak to that.
So in terms of gender, obviously Barack Obama was a special case in terms of being the first black president, and now we have Hillary Clinton, who has, for better or for worse, brought the question of gender into the political equation, so to speak. And that's been met with a lot of controversial statements by different journalists and other politicians. And we just wanted to play this video so that you could see some of these.
Spaghetti marinara on the couch. 1 box Barilla spaghetti, al dente. 1 jar Barilla marinara.
Attacks against Hillary Clinton based on the sound of her voice, the volume of her voice, have become more and more common. Is she a presidential candidate, or is she trying to star in the Scream reboot? We go to the mainstream media to find out, with people both on the left and on the right saying that they have a problem with how Hillary Clinton speaks. First, we have Bob Woodward, who hopefully you are familiar with, speaking with Joe Scarborough.
I think a lot of it with Hillary Clinton has to do with style and delivery, oddly enough. She shouts. There's something unrelaxed about the way she is communicating, and I think that just jumps off this.
So Bob, it's interesting you said that, because last night I was watching her, and I said to myself, has nobody told her that the microphone works?
People have mentioned this before, Scarborough, don't worry. Next, Geraldo.
Sounds like Bernie. She switched like a commercial. Lena Dunham, a girl, says to call her angry is sexist. I just want to. She looked angry. She sounded angry. Everything missing like a lot. It did sound a lot like Howard Dean. I wonder if it was the same hall as Howard Dean was in, where you're screaming like that. Why are you screaming? You have a microphone. It's amplified, and when you shriek that way, it is such an unprecedented. I'm talking audio. I'm not talking sex. Well, I'm not talking gender. I'm talking like maybe she needs a rock and roller earphone.
Rock and roll.
So notice how notice how in the second clip there, they compared her to Bernie, meaning Bernie Sanders, and also Howard Dean, but they don't comment on their so-called screaming or screeching being a negative thing. But Hillary can't do that for whatever reason. He says it's not a gender thing, but many have accused it of being such. So here's a few comments about her speech. Bob Woodward, his comments that you saw in the first clip there, was one of the ones that really got people talking about this on social media and in the mainstream media, saying that, saying these things is actually sexist, and we shouldn't hold Hillary Clinton's voice to a different kind of standard, or where are these standards even coming from? So some linguists have actually looked at this, and Hillary Clinton actually lowers her speech during the course of speaking. So all of these claims about her screeching and being really high-pitched, and all of these other claims that have been levied at her are not actually the case. And this has been a trend over the past half century or so, probably extending far beyond that, that a lot of female politicians actually do take courses even to lower their speech and consciously lower their speech when speaking in formal circumstances. And so when they say that her speech doesn't sound relaxed, well, it's probably not, because she's working really hard to have it sound the way that she does. She also breathes from her chest more. That could, create different kinds of effects through a microphone. It can make it sound more strained. Interestingly, like sniffing into a microphone apparently doesn't have any gendered connotations, but having a strained voice in a microphone for some reason does. And her pitch and amplitude for her voice is actually fairly average. So based on the size of your vocal tract and everything, Hillary Clinton's voice is not, exceptional in any way in that regard. And Mark Lieberman actually did an analysis of the third debate, so to see the intonation range. So the purple line there is the debate moderator, who has a pretty even tone, and these points represent the standard deviation from the mean across the first three answers. And the red line is Trump, so his voice actually goes up quite a bit over the course of the first three answers. And as you can see, Hillary Clinton sort of like hovers around the middle there. So there were accusations after all three debates that she was also screeching and having this high-pitched voice and everything, but as you can see, that's not really the case. Okay, so as Walt already mentioned, she has this absence of marked dialect features, which in some ways works against her because she isn't able to capitalize on any kind of authenticity from a particular group or a particular regional salience, and that sort of feeds into these stereotypes of her being untrustworthy, because trustworthiness is associated with some of these more quote-unquote authentic dialect features and speech styles. And some have said a clean accent sounds too guarded and perfect. So you can see how some of the things that have been said about her voice, and notably in this case the absence of dialect features, translates onto what people say about her personality. That she's too guarded, she's too focus group approved, and all of this kind of thing. Gendered speech also comes in a lot here. People always love to talk about women's speech, and there's significant attention to women's speech. Is it worse than men's speech? Is it so the deficit model, so do women need to talk more like men, or is it just different? Things like vocal fry, which Hillary Clinton doesn't actually use, uptalk, she also doesn't use that, but all of these things are always talked about in relationship to both Hillary Clinton and other female politicians. And we're sort of in a strange, or a new position here, because she's been breaking these traditional gender barriers. She's our first nominee, female nominee for president from a major party. And so we're kind of in new territory. As I said, women are much more scrutinized and often criticized for how they speak. One study done showed that 85% of women have been told that they sound too ambitious. If you think about, professional men, the accusation that a man would sound too ambitious based on his linguistic speech markers seems kind of ludicrous. Like, you wouldn't really hear that even be levied. But 85% of women apparently sound too ambitious in their speech. Another thing that has been talked about a lot, if you've been following these things on social media, are the amount of times that interruptions happened during the 3 official political debates that we had between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. In general, men tend to interrupt women more in conversations, and women are interrupted more by both men and other women. And this is just based on a lot of studies that have been done by linguists over decades, and that's what they've found. So in terms of the specific situation of political debates, they have fixed rules about interruptions, namely that you cannot do it. It is part of the rules of these all 3 debates that you're not supposed to interrupt other people, especially in the 2-minute answers that you might be familiar with. Each candidate has 2 minutes to answer a particular question. They're not supposed to be interrupted by the other or the moderator for any reason. So it's not just an impolite kind of thing for these debates. It's actually against the rules. But as you probably know, it does happen quite a bit, despite these rules. So this video,
excuse me.
this is a video of every interruption that happened in the first debate.
Oh, bring back jobs.
I think a lot about what worked and how we can make it work again.
Well, he
$3
approved
million
NAFTA.
new jobs,
He
a
approved
balanced
NAFTA,
budget.
which is the single
and
straight deal
incomes-
ever approved in this
Incomes
country.
went up.
No, you're telling the enemy everything you want to do.
No, we're not.
See, you're telling the enemy everything you want to do.
I wrote about that in...
You called it the gold standard.
Well,
You called it the gold standard of trade
And
deals. You
you know
said it's
what?
the finest deal you've ever seen.
No,
And-
but when it was negotiated,
Not.
which I wrote about that...
So is it President Obama's fault? Is it President Obama's fault?
Even announced. Look, there
Secretary, is it President Obama's fault? But you have no plan.
Oh, I do.
Secretary,
In fact,
you have
I've
no
written
plan.
a book about it.
Let's open the next segment.
Well, could I just finish? I think I should. You go to our website, and you take a look at her website. She's going to raise taxes $1.3 trillion. And there's nothing crazy about not letting our companies bring their money back into their country.
So
it goes on like that. There's quite a bit. And if you notice, that included also interrupting the moderator and Clinton's interruptions of Trump. So that was all of them, but it gives you sort of a general idea. It depends on who you ask, how many interruptions actually happened during that debate. There was this big controversy among online news reporting. So Fox came up with 51 interruptions by Trump against Hillary Clinton, and Hillary Clinton interrupted him 17 times. 538 came up with a whopping number of 3 interruptions, and Hillary Clinton did not interrupt Trump at all, according to 538. So some others sort of fall in between those 2 numbers. Most of the counts were done by reporters, not linguists, with the exception of the Poland language, the data from the Poland language log, which came up with a number closer to Vox's number, so closer to the 5117. And there were also a lot of arguments saying that, oh, well, it's not sexism, it's just Donald Trump's way of speaking, or it's a power dominance kind of thing. But I think it's important to know that you can't separate issues like power and gender, and saying that, well, Donald Trump also interrupted men during the primary debates doesn't really give you a full picture. You have to look at the actual quality of these interruptions. And one that you're most likely familiar with.
Look, we need energy. Some say gotta rely on alternatives. Wind, solar, or stick with oil, natural gas, traditional energy. Try this, all of the above. Now that's real energy security. I'm Maggie and I'm an energy voter.
Well, Chris, I am on record as saying that we need to put more money in the Social Security Trust Fund. That's part of my commitment to raise taxes on the wealthy. My Social Security payroll contribution will go up, as will Donald's, assuming he can't figure out how to get out of it. But what we want to do is to replenish the Social Security Trust Fund by making sure that...
So she continues on without really acknowledging his interruption. But it's worth looking at the quality of these interruptions to see that some interruption, like such a nasty woman, is not genderless. Like that has a gendered tone to it, and is not simply, it cannot be explained away simply by he's trying to maintain dominance of the floor.
Okay, so one of the things that we found in looking at this stuff is you can find all kinds of contrastive stuff. I mean, everything from sort of how fast their syllables are, how much silence there is. So there's this wide swath of things that are pretty readily generatable in terms of data. And here we had to sort of select just a couple. But there are also issues of how language is manipulated for political purpose, and the presentation effect of these things and its effect on voters. So I'm just going to look at one type. This is just one of many, many different kinds of relatively seamless generation of data, and that is sort of preferred choice of all of the talks by all of the Republicans and the Democrats. All right. So we look at sort of, you can look at things like 2-word phrases, 3-word phrases, you know, and all those sorts of things, just to give you an idea of this kind of comparison. There are also sort of additional observations that come from this sort of study in terms of what's talked about. So Republicans often invoke Benghazi and terrorism and enemies, Islamic terrorism, radical. Republicans frame immigration in terms of borders. And among those issues, you know, Democrats tend to talk about things like healthcare and so forth. One of the things you can look at, for example, is Democrats appear to use a little more colloquial speech. That is, they use more contractions rather than full forms and stuff like that. So all of these are open. Perhaps, and sort of, it's easy to sort of crank out this data and contrast it and come up with significant differences. The more significant issue is how you interpret these sorts of things. But one of the things that comes up is sort of the application of language pragmatics, what speakers' intentions are. And for this, I won't in an effort to save a little time, I won't go to the actual clip, but there's this famous Second Amendment statement that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, if you follow the news at all, where Trump says, Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is. I don't know. You know, and so you get these sorts of things, and one of the things that comes up, okay, does this constitute sort of a call to sort of have the Second Amendment people go after him? And these things sort of get into things like presupposition and implicature and entailment, the sort of things that are studied in language pragmatics. So, for example, if you take Make America Great Again, you know, presupposes America has been great at some previous point, you know, and as Bill Clinton said the other day, look, I'm a Southerner. I know what Make America Great Again really means for a Southerner, right? So go back to that. Or, for example, cricket Hillary, there's nothing you can really do in terms of the presupposition of that condition other than challenge the condition itself. But some of this stuff is done by implicature, so, well, everybody here knows what an implicature is, maybe, we hope. Okay, so if I say, I just ran out of gas, and somebody says to me, there's a gas station around the corner, and I go around the gas, and the gas station's closed and doesn't sell gas anymore, and I come in and say, dude, I ran out of gas and you told me there's a gas station. I didn't say it sold gas. I said it was a gas station, right? And we all lie by implicature, don't we? Okay. But look at this statement, sort of, I can't find a false statement, which then implies, oh, I'm telling the truth, which is what in fact happens with Hillary's email stuff, you know? And in terms of Donald Trump's Second Amendment stuff, we see that, okay, so there's nothing you do, folks, possible exception is a subset of the electorate, all right? And then you have this modal adjunct maybe entails, yeah, there is something you can do, it's only a possibility, nothing definite, and then I don't know, which is a hedge by which one can purport to distance oneself from the conversational implicature. So he says, I don't know. Okay, so he doesn't know, therefore he distanced himself from the words. Now, in the case of Hillary Clinton and the infamous emails, all right, in an interview with Chris Wallace, Hillary says, I am confident that I never sent or received any information that was classified at the time. And Chris Wallace challenges her and says, after a long investigation, FBI Director James Comey said none of these things that you told the American public were true. And Hillary Clinton says, Director Comey said my answers were truthful and what I've said is consistent with what I've told the American people, that there were decisions discussed and made to classify retroactively certain of the emails. Okay, and here's what Comey actually said. Although we did not find clear evidence that Secretary Clinton or her colleagues intended to violate laws governing the handling of classified information, there is evidence that they were extremely careless in their handling of very sensitive, highly classified information. And then on another occasion said, we have no basis to conclude that she lied to the FBI, which means, okay, if I'm declared not guilty, all right, then I can't be guilty. She did lie, and then they said, did she lie to the public? And Comey said, that's a question I'm not qualified to answer, all right? So by implicature, what we see is that Hillary Clinton says, you know, Comey said that I told the truth because he said we don't have any evidence that she lied, all right? Which is a quite different statement and shows you how this works. Now, the most recent conversation has been about, which is really an interesting one, is the use of believe me versus I believe, which there's an interesting article that came out by Tyre Schnoebelen, all right, about their use. So here's an example of Trump's believe me, all right? So he's talking about the meeting with the president of Mexico, very nice man. We will be doing very much better with Mexico. And then he said, believe me, all right? And these sorts of statements are fairly common. And so they were tabulated. I mean, it's pretty easy to sort of find corpora and tabulate this. So if you look, for example, at the frequency patterns of Donald Trump's saying, believe me, all right, compared with other Republicans, and Hillary Clinton's use of that, you see this sort of dramatic difference in terms. So on the other hand, if you look at I believe, all right, you see Donald Trump way down, and other Republicans significantly above that, and Hillary Clinton is, you know, up there with the other Democrats. Interestingly enough, they've also looked at the different positions. So if it's in the position in the beginning of a sentence, right? Believe me, this is how the thing will, or in the middle of the sentence, or at the end of the sentence, what you see is that Trump's believe me's tend to be more dramatically different in terms of final position. All right, which is kind of an interesting difference between him and other speakers who use this. All right, this has also become sort of a one of the points where people have picked up on it, and I won't play this segment where basically Tim Kaine mocks him and says, believe me, all right? And so we can analyze his intonation and his prominence. And Trump, if you look at the intonational contours, all right, what you see is Trump says, "Believe me," all right, where you see in the first segment, "believe," it's longer, and you see in Kane's imitation of Trump, all right, it's "believe me," all right. So there's a sort of parody that he works into his mocking of Trump on that occasion. Okay, so how do we interpret stuff like this in terms of politics? Well, first of all, there's an imperative, a kind of directive to trust what is said, right? So if somebody says, and in terms of authority, think of it, okay, if you, in a second we'll talk about sort of the models of ideology that inform politics, a la George Lakoff and others. But, so who says "believe me," right? A parent would say "believe me" to a kid, all right? "Look, kid, you better go out and practice every day if you're going to be a good ball player." That's typical male, all right? "Believe me," all right? They don't say, "I believe that," all right? So we have this authority status that is invoked vis-a-vis a personal belief. And in terms of the case that I gave you, the implicatures are of Clinton's husband was responsible for the trade deals, which is certainly questionable. Trump will do better than with Mexico on trade, and that Clinton will make the country a mess. But these "believe me's" are kind of meta statements in the discourse, right? So they're sort of like when he interrupts and he says, "not," you know, those sorts of things sort of go beyond the discourse and become comments about the discourse. Talking about that, we'll have one more example, and then we'll talk about the ideology and then open it for questions, okay? And this is the use of the definite article.
Yeah, so there's a particular construction that people have started to notice recently. It even became a hashtag when Trump said, "Ask the gays." I won't play the clip due to time.
Yeah, we have time.
We do have time?
No, but go ahead.
Okay.
And for the women out there, ask the people of Saudi Arabia what they think of women. And for the gays out there, ask the gays and ask the people. Ask the gays what they think and what they do in not only Saudi Arabia, in many of these countries with the gay community. Just ask them. And then you tell me, who's your friend? Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton? You tell me.
So that was pretty immediately considered offensive. And it like struck off this whole like hashtag thing, "Ask the gays." His referring to the gay community as the quote-unquote gays is been something that has like really elicited some very negative reactions, and it is due to the particular linguistic structure that it creates. So some people use it in ironic contexts, but generally people who do that are people who already know that this construction is offensive. So he also has the famous clip where he talks about the blacks, where he says, I'm very successful with the blacks. The blacks love me. I'm very popular with the blacks." And he just like repeats it a bunch of times. And people are very clearly disturbed by this. In the clip, it's a newscaster, and they play his recording, and this was 5 years ago, I think. And then there is an African-American woman who is responding to this, and she's clearly very upset by this, knows that it's very offensive, and people know that it's bad, but why is this? So there's some YouTube comments below this clip about the gays, about the blacks, and so for example, quote, "The blacks as if we're not human. The black family from Harry Potter makes us sound like we're some robotic army." And then like the mocking, "I love the browns, yes I do. I also have a great relationship with the yellows," sort of making fun of this. The blacks, come on, that just sounds ignorant. So people obviously know that this is something bad. And another YouTube comment up there, LOL, it is as if he is referring to blacks as if they are a completely identical homogenous group. And this is really the crux of the matter. This is why it sounds so bad and so offensive. So linguistically, the format of this construction is the definite article the, some adjective, and then the plural marker s on the end. The adjective, so whether it is black, gay, poor, transgender, illegal, etc., but those are some of the most common ones that are used in this construction. The adjective becomes a noun with the definite article and the plural marker on the end. And that process is actually removing the personhood of a person, of a human being, of the one being described, by objectifying them. And on an individual level, it essentializes the person into only one of their descriptors. So someone who is black or who is gay now that one descriptor becomes all of their personhood. And they are described as, this person is not just gay, this person is part of the gays. And it refuses to acknowledge any other aspects of that person's personhood. And by extension, the fact that they can have many descriptors other than the one that has just been nominalized. On a group level, it's also an essentializing term, and an essentializing construction, and it basically erases any internal deviations or any internal differences within the group that that descriptor is supposed to be referring to. So by saying the gays, it completely disregards any kind of internal differences there, and the linguistic term for that would be erasure, a la Galen Irvine. Yeah, and becomes just, people are just defined by their particular, of that one descriptor.
Okay, the last section, and I'll move through this relatively quickly, is George Jacob, the linguist, who says that the issue with politics is that there's this whole sort of framing that goes on in terms in which these frames shape the way we see the world, and as a result of that, things are viewed in their various, so that concepts are not things that can be changed by someone telling us a fact. So one of the things that comes up with these, and I'm sort of mystified because I may say to my wife, how can women watch all of this stuff about the sexual assaults and not be affected by that, Because you hear people say, well, I'm just going to vote for him, all right? And that's the way it is. And Lakoff would say, well, that's the way politics is because there are these overriding frames that actually sort of allow us to give up other kinds of interests in terms of this sort of cognitive frame model. And in that context, he says the frame for politics is the notion of the family, all right? And we sort of learn our family first, and then the notion of the family is extended to our nation. So we have founding fathers, interestingly enough. We send our sons and daughters to war. Our nation is our home. We have homeland security. And in that, so we have these metaphors that we extend. And he says there are two types of families. The nurturant family, which is more progressive, and the strict father family, which is more conservative. And so in the strict father family, we have father knows best. He's the ultimate authority. We're responsible personally for what we do. There's this hierarchy of sort of roles, and which people get what they deserve. So poor people in that frame, poor people are poor because they haven't used their opportunities adequately, right? It's through another reason. And it tends to be more aligned with conservative. Whereas the nurturant family is quite different in this respect, where we have respect and compassion are taught by example, not directive, and so forth. And that's why he says it aligns. So even in terms of family ties, Trump is America's very own malignant daddy warbucks, you know. Hillary Clinton is biologically primed to be a leader because of her estrogen levels. Levels rise and fall to help meet her biological demands, which are often about giving to others, attracting a mate, bearing children, and nurturing the family. Oh my goodness. Okay, actually, I guess it was on Saturday Night Live this past weekend. I don't know if you saw it, where Tom Hanks did a routine on as America's daddy. All right, and there are lots of mechanisms that are used to do this, which range from repetition, you know. So for example, repeating something like "Make America Great Again," and actually, as you ask students, like, can you think of themes? Yeah, Republicans, George Lakoff says, are great at slogans. Democrats aren't very good at all, and George Lakoff would like to make them better, but somehow they don't listen to him. So there are all these sorts of things that frame that, and as Kelsey points out, you know, this is not just the case in the American situation. This is the case throughout the world in terms of other kinds of political situations as well. So the point is that in this respect, it's not a matter of facts. It's really a matter of sort of ideological framing that sets us up to adopt and vote for certain people. And in this context, values come first, facts and policies serve as values. And it all starts with these sorts of values. So arguing facts is not really very relevant in politics. And Lakoff's point is that positive, truthful frames counter negative frames. You can't rebut negative things. So he has this book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And the point of Don't Think of an Elephant is the more you try to combat that, as, for example, a Democrat, the less successful you are, because saying not to think of an elephant makes you think of an elephant, right? So it's sort of like kids in school. So you say to the kids, whatever you do, don't put the raisins up your nose. They didn't think of it until you told them that, right? And it's like my grandkids in the car the other day were playing a game, and the game was don't think of an elephant. And so one would say to the other, don't think of an elephant. You just thought of one, right? You know. So there's a sense in which that actually works in terms of and his other point is that we have to give up identity politics in terms of particular groups, whether it's black, LGBT, women, and so forth, to human issues of freedom and inclusion. So we want people to be free, we want people to be included, and that's our fundamental values. So in a sense, we're fighting a frame with an alternative frame. So to conclude, I guess we would say, and this is just the short version of the filibuster, what we want you to do is reflect and recognize the significance of language in political life, you know, because it's there, and it's open to us because sociolinguistics has language everywhere, every place. All right. Appreciate how linguistic and sociolinguistic analysis can contribute to understanding politicians and voters, and be aware truth, authenticity, and ideology are highly informed by language use. So have a happy election day. I voted early, and so my deed is done. Go out of here immediately to the polls and vote. So if you have any questions, Kelsey will answer them.
So I was curious when you were talking about how Trump described Hillary as being like a nasty woman. I was imagining it in both cases, like saying like, oh, like what a vile man. How do you distinguish like those types of statements as like being like a gender specific issue versus just like referring to an individual?
So the interesting thing is that you don't get a lot of the reverse. You don't get a lot of, you know, female politicians attacking male politicians based on their maleness, I guess. So you could have, I mean, obviously there have been people who have accused him of being a sexist, misogynist, based on particular things that he said that could take on a gender tone in terms of his maleness. But you don't get Hillary Clinton interrupting him during the debates to call him a vile man, or to, you know, say something about, you know, male genitalia. Like you don't really get a lot of that. So it's hard to make that distinction, I guess, in the other direction, because there is so much coming, I guess, against like female identified people from both men and women. And it's not just men who are making these comments, but it does come from both, which goes back to what Walt was talking about the frames. You know, you have a particular frame that you work within, and if that is part of that frame, then you will have those sorts of outlooks whether or not you choose to make comments about them. So you really have to kind of like look at it in a broader picture in terms of the frames as well as the comments that are being made in a particular context.
Just the thing that I would say is, so why didn't he say, you're a nasty person? All right? Why did he say woman? Or it's
Or
sort
even
of,
you're nasty.
or yeah, you're nasty. You're a nasty ass. But, or, you know, think of it the other way. What man has ever had his speech described as shrill or screechy? Why is it only women who have shrill voices or screech? Why? Where's the man, you know? Men talk loud. Exhibit A, you know, but think of the connotations of someone talking loud versus someone screeching, right? Which would you rather have? A loud person than a screechy person. But notice sort of the attribution and the differential between men and women there. Any other questions? Yeah.
So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying about Bernie Sanders being seen as authentic due to his dialect. What are people saying the same thing with Trump's New York dialect, or does class tend to interfere with that issue of authenticity at all? Do people talk about
yeah,
it in that way? Like, listen to him, he sounds like one of us. Or...
Well, I mean, the thing is, you have to think of it not sort of as sort of directly indexing that, but if you think of it in terms of, okay, so he represents the sort of anti-establishment, the anti-politician movement, all right? And in that context, sort of being regionalized is probably an advantage rather than a disadvantage. That's my assessment of that. And the other thing is, because of the class differential between Bernie Sanders and him, and also the locational difference in terms of Brooklyn and Manhattan, there was a difference in terms of sort of their awes to begin with. So his awe is not nearly as sort of salient as Bernie Sanders' awe, and he's not artless for the most part. But the thing is, you know, it's not like we can sort of essentialize any of this stuff and say that Bernie Sanders is authentic because of his dialect. You know, what we're talking about is this aspect of his speaking style, that is his personal identification, is one of the components that makes up to this sort of personage that he's presenting in public. As opposed to Hillary Clinton, you know, who doesn't appear to have salient dialect features that anybody would know, And it's not like this is what makes her sort of a deceitful camouflage person, but it certainly is one of the components that contributes to it. Now, how much it contributes to it, only a statistical analysis could tell. And no one here, even Robin, would be able to do that analysis. Any other questions? Well, yeah.
Just because I'm so young that I can't remember, I'm just curious in terms of George W. Bush, did people comment on his accent when he was running?
Well, people who didn't like him did.
Okay.
But people, you know, the other aspect of George Bush is one of the things that made him very popular with lots of people was he's a guy you could have a beer with, right? As if you would have a beer with the president, right? But he was, and actually if you heard his speech and heard it, you know, he really was pretty colloquial, if not a little bit vernacular. And so, and that was part of his persona of sort of being like the rest of us, which was one of the things that some people found attractive, whereas Al Gore would not project that. Well, thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest. And vote your conscience, if you have one. No! Really, vote your frame.